She spent 3 years building the case that would destroy him. He spent 3 seconds deciding to save her. The law never prepared her for that. The silence of courtroom 4B was not a lack of sound. It was a physical weight. It was the heavy, clinical stillness that only exists in places where the architecture is designed to swallow a person's future. Federal Judge Betsy R. Johnson sat behind the high mahogany bench, her spine a perfectly straight line, her robes draped around her like armor. To the observers in the gallery, she was the embodiment of the law, impartial, distant, and unyielding. To herself, she was a predator who had finally cornered its prey. For 3 years, she had lived with the name Pietro Marino. She had breathed his ledger entries, memorized his shell companies, and traced the invisible ink of his influence across the city's skyline. She knew the exact way he tilted his head when a witness lied, a subtle, predatory stillness that most people mistook for boredom. She knew the way danger wore a charcoal gray Italian suit and called itself patience. Across the room, Pietro sat at the defense table. He didn't look like a man facing 40 years in a maximum security cell. He sat with the relaxed posture of a man attending a board meeting he had scheduled himself. He didn't fidget. He didn't whisper to his counsel. He simply waited. For a fraction of a second, his dark, intense eyes lifted and met hers. There was no plea in them, no anger. Just a cold, measuring recognition. He looked away first, and Betsy felt the small, sharp thrill of a point scored. By tomorrow morning, Pietro Marino would be facing 40 years. She had made sure of it. She had triple-checked every thread of evidence, every sealed testimony, every number that didn't lie. She was ready. The law was ready. And Pietro Marino, for all his power, had nothing left to reach for. "Court is adjourned until 9 a.m. tomorrow," she announced, her voice echoing with the finality of a gavel. The transition from the majesty of the bench to the mundane reality of the parking structure was a ritual of decompression. Betsy traded the robes for a tailored blazer, collected her briefcase, and walked alone through the concrete echoes of the garage. Her mind was already 3 movements ahead, drafting the closing instructions that would seal the Marino legacy in a federal vault. She pulled out onto the street. It was a typical Chicago night. The air was sharp with the scent of lake water and exhaust, the city humming with the indifferent energy of millions of people who had no idea the foundations of the underworld were about to shift. She was 3 blocks from the courthouse, merging onto a quiet stretch of the inner drive, when she heard it. It wasn't a roar. It wasn't the cinematic screech of tires. It was a sound so polite it was terrifying. Beep, beep, beep. It was faint, rhythmic, and coming from somewhere beneath her floorboards. Betsy's eyes dropped instinctively to the dashboard, then to the floor mats. Nothing. She tightened her grip on the wheel, momentarily dismissing it as a loose sensor or an interference from the city's grid. She was a judge, a woman of facts and logic, not a mechanic prone to flights of fancy. But the sound didn't stop. It steadied, becoming metronomic. It had the specific, horrible patience of something that was counting down with the manners to keep quiet about it. Her stomach dropped before her mind caught up. That sound wasn't mechanical failure. It had intention. She began to ease her foot off the accelerator, intending to pull over and inspect the undercarriage, and the beeping quickened. It turned into a high, frantic chirping that vibrated through the soles of her shoes. Panic, cold and sharp, flared in her chest, but she suppressed it with a decade of judicial discipline. She maintained her speed, her heart hammering a frantic counter-rhythm against her ribs. A black car materializes beside her like it was always there. It was a sleek, predatory shadow, keeping her exact speed with the effortless precision of a wolf pacing a deer. The tinted window rolled down, and the last person Betsy expected to see appeared in the frame. Pietro Marino. He wasn't the defendant anymore. He wasn't wearing the suit designed for the jury's eyes. He was in the dark, behind the wheel of a car that moved like a weapon, looking at her with an expression that was urgently, almost uncomfortably close to concern. "Don't stop the car," he said. His voice was a low, controlled vibration that cut through the wind between their vehicles. It was the voice of a man who had delivered death sentences before and learned to strip the panic out of the delivery, so the recipient could actually hear the instructions. Betsy's jaw tightens, her knuckles white on the steering wheel. "Mr. Marino, this is a violation of—" "There is a bomb under your car, Judge," he interrupted, his eyes locked onto hers with a terrifying intensity. "If you decelerate, if you brake, if you pull over, if you drop below the speed you're holding right now, it detonates. It's a mercury switch paired with a speed sensor. Keep driving." Match my speed. And for once in your life, do not argue with me. The silence between their two windows was enormous, filled only by the roar of the wind and the relentless beep 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 of the fail-safe. Every instinct Betsy had built over 15 years of legal practice screamed that this was a gambit. Pietro was losing. He was a master of leverage. He was creating a crisis to make himself the savior. She almost slammed on the brakes out of sheer, indignant defiance. She almost chose the law over the man. Until her dashboard lit up. The alert didn't wail. It didn't flash red like a Hollywood prop. Her car, German-engineered and quietly intelligent, simply presented the data as it was programmed to do. Foreign object detected, chassis undercarriage classification, unknown attached device threat probability, explosive, 70% recommendation, do not stop vehicle. Contact emergency services. 70%, she whispered to the empty passenger seat. 70% meant a 30% chance it was a sensor error. In a courtroom, 30% was more than enough for reasonable doubt. But as she felt the vibration of the engine beneath her, 30% had never felt so thin. It was a paper shield against a wall of fire. She looked back at Pietro. He was watching her the way he had watched her from the defense table, measuring the weight of her resolve. He wasn't waiting for her to break. He was waiting for her to decide. Betsy realized then that the courtroom was gone. The robes were gone. There was only the road, the bomb, and the man she had spent 3 years trying to destroy. "Where are we going?" she asked, her voice steady despite the adrenaline flooding her system. Something shifted in Pietro's expression. It wasn't triumph. It was something quieter, a flicker of something that looked impossibly like respect. "There's a bridge overpass on Mercier, a slight downward grade," Pietro said, his car inching closer to hers, nearly brushing her side mirror. "When I give you the signal, you're going to open your door and jump. I'll catch you." Betsy let out a short, hysterical breath. "You'll catch me." From a moving vehicle. Into another moving vehicle. "I've done worse," he replied flatly. "That is not the reassurance you think it is, Mr. Marino," she snapped, her eyes fixed on the road ahead. "No," Pietro said, and for a fleeting second, the ghost of a smile touched his jaw. "But it's the truth. And right now, Judge, that's all either of us has left." The bridge overpass materialized out of the Chicago gloom with terrifying speed. Pietro's car held steady beside her, a scant foot of night air between their windows, both vehicles screaming down the empty stretch at a pace that made the city blur into streaks of amber and cold light. "Now," Pietro said. His voice wasn't loud or urgent. It was the way a surgeon says scalpel. Betsy didn't let herself think. Thinking was for building cases and drafting motions. Thinking, right now, was a death sentence. She unclipped her seatbelt and shoved the door open. The wind hit her like a physical wall, yanking her blazer sideways and turning her long hair into a weapon against her own face. The road beneath her was a gray blur moving at a speed human beings were never designed to perceive from outside a vehicle. She pulled herself up. Roof of the car. Both hands flat against the cold metal, the vibration of the engine running up through her palms like a current. One breath. She looked at Pietro. He had already moved, standing through his own sunroof, one hand braced, the other arm open and waiting. His eyes were locked on hers with a focused calm. "Trust the fall," he said. And Betsy R. Johnson, federal judge, 15 years on the bench, built entirely from the unshakable belief that the law was the strongest thing in any room, leaped. She was mid-air when the world behind her ended. The blast didn't roar. It cracked, a sound so absolute it wasn't heard so much as felt as a pressure wave that rewritten the air itself. The fireball bloomed outward in a ring of orange and white, and the shockwave hit her like a wall of heat. It didn't push her, it threw her. Her calculated arc was erased in a violent instant. She became weightless in the worst possible way, her body tumbling through the night, fire behind her and dark sky above. Pietro's arms closed around her. The blast wave hit them both. They crashed through the sunroof together, not a landing, but a collision of bodies and physics. The car swerved hard, jumped the shoulder of the road, and plowed through the guardrail into the dense brush of the embankment. Metal screamed. Glass shattered. The world rolled once, then stopped. The silence that followed was heavy and ringing. Pietro moved first. He always moved first. He pulled himself upright through the caved-in roof, glass in his hair and a cut along his jaw bleeding with quiet efficiency. He didn't check himself. He looked immediately to his left. Betsy was still. A bruise was already darkening at her temple, and a gash along her collarbone marked where the seatbelt had bitten into her skin. He pressed 2 fingers to her throat. The pulse was strong. "Not here," he muttered to the burning wreck 200 meters up the road. "Not tonight." He gathered her against him, one arm beneath her knees and one behind her back, and disappeared into the dark. Betsy came back to consciousness in layers. Layer 1, warmth. Layer 2, a specific, catalogued pain spreading from her shoulder and ribs, and a throb at her temple that pulsed in rhythm with her heart. Layer 3, the ceiling. It was smooth, low-profile concrete lit by recessed lights that hummed with the authority of serious infrastructure. She sat up too fast. The room tilted. Slowly. Pietro Marino was seated in a chair pulled several feet from the bed, a deliberate distance so she wouldn't wake to a stranger looming over her. He had removed his jacket, his shirt rolled to the elbows, a strip of medical tape running along his forearm. He looked, for the first time in 3 years, human. Not less dangerous, but human. "You've been out for 4 hours, he said, setting a glass of water on the bedside table. "You have a mild concussion, 2 cracked ribs, and a shoulder that's going to make you miserable for 3 weeks. Nothing is broken beyond that." Betsy stared at him, her voice rough. "You're not a doctor." "No," he agreed. "But mine is." She insisted on getting up. Pietro didn't stop her, watching with the patience of a man who knew she needed to assess her environment before she could think. The suite was underground but sophisticated, clean lines, dark materials, and medical equipment along one wall. Monitors on a nearby desk showed camera feeds of tunnels and street-level views. "How far under?" she asked, her spine straightening into a judge's posture despite her bare feet. 20 meters, he said. "Under the financial district. Ironic, I suppose." She turned to face him fully. "You were a secondary target. The bomb was designed to eliminate us both." "Yes," Pietro met her eyes. "Someone wanted the trial to end. Permanently. With no one left to ask questions about why." "Who knew your route last night?" "A short list," he said. "I've already begun narrowing it." "So have I," she said quietly. It started practically. Pietro's doctor had left a medical kit, but the cracked ribs made it impossible for Betsy to reach the gash along her collarbone. She stiffened as she tried to angle her arm, an involuntary gasp escaping her. Pietro crossed the room. "Sit. This isn't a negotiation." She sat. He crouched in front of her, opening the kit. The blazer had to come off first. It was torn and stiff with dried blood. He worked at it quietly, easing the fabric free with a patience that didn't match the man she had prosecuted. He produced a small surgical scissor. "I need to cut this," he said, eyes meeting hers, waiting for permission. "Fine," she said. The scissors moved slowly up the seam. The blazer fell away, leaving her in a torn white blouse. He began to clean the wound. His hands were steady, practicing an actual gentleness that was far more disorienting than the explosion itself. Betsy looked at the wall, counting the seconds to keep her breathing even. "You've done this before," she said, keeping her voice academic. "Field medicine. More times than I'd recommend," he murmured. "You could have left me in the car," she said, the question finally surfacing. "Before the jump. Why didn't you?" Pietro didn't stop moving. "Because it wasn't my bomb, and I don't let other people's messes become my character." He looked up then, close enough for her to see the dark depths of his eyes. "And because, for what it's worth, you ran a fair trial, Judge. You deserve to live through it." Betsy said nothing. There was no precedent in case law for a defendant showing respect while pressing gauze to a judge's skin in a bunker. "When I find out who did this," she said finally, "I'm going to need evidence. A proper chain of custody. Something that will hold up." "Betsy." Her name in his voice stopped her cold. "The person who built that bomb," Pietro said carefully, "is not going to a courtroom." The silence that followed was long and full of the realization she didn't want to admit, that he was right, and she wasn't sure how she felt about it anymore. She had woken up in the defendant's world. And the most frightening thing, the thing she would lie awake cataloging with clinical precision, was that it didn't feel like a cage. It felt, God help her, like the first honest room she'd been in years. The morning after the fire was defined by a silence, so profound it felt like a physical weight. Betsy hadn't slept. It wasn't the pain from her cracked ribs, though every breath was a sharp negotiation. It was her mind. After 15 years on the bench, her brain didn't know how to go offline. It simply built cases in the dark. By 5 a.m., she was sitting at the desk, swallowed by a dark shirt Pietro had left for her. It was too large at the shoulders, smelling faintly of cedar and expensive tobacco. When Pietro emerged at 5:47 a.m., He found her staring at the concrete wall as if it owed her a confession. He didn't speak. He made coffee and set a cup beside her. She didn't thank him, but she drank it immediately. "I need to see everything you have," she said, her voice like iron. "Good morning to you too, Judge." "Don't," she snapped, not with malice, but with the precision of a woman who had no time for social graces. "Show me." Pietro studied her for a moment over his cup, then crossed to the far wall and pressed an invisible panel. It slid open to reveal a room within the room, a space covered in the organized, deliberate architecture of a parallel investigation. "I've had this for 8 months, Pietro said, standing in the doorway. "Someone began redirecting funds 14 months ago. By the time I noticed, they had moved enough to fund a small war, or a very precise assassination." Betsy stepped inside, her eyes scanning the documents with rapid-fire professional instinct. "You knew someone was stealing through you, using your organization as a tunnel." "The money moved through shell accounts," Pietro said, stepping closer. "Through legitimate businesses. Through a federal holding account." The room went ice cold. Pietro opened a file on the table. Betsy began to read, her mind cataloging the steps. Microtransfers to avoid flagging, laundering through a Delaware firm called Viridian Strategic Group, and finally, a numbered account, VS Holdings 7. VS Holdings 7 funded the device. Pietro tapped the final sheet. "Paid for the engineer. Paid for the confirmation of our deaths." Betsy picked up the Viridian registration. Her face remained a judicial mask, but her eyes darkened. "Who registered this?" "A woman named Claire Osei. A professional paralegal. She's clean, just a front." "Claire Osei," Betsy repeated, her voice dropping to a whisper. "I know that name. I signed the discovery documents listing her as a pre-approved vendor for my office." She stepped back, her hands flat on the table as the architecture of the betrayal collapsed into a single point. "The vendor list is managed by the Chief of Staff's office. I implemented that security measure myself." She pointed to the authorization code at the bottom of the contract, CS7. "That's the internal tracking code for my Chief of Staff." "Marcus," she breathed. Pietro watched her. He gave her 40 seconds of silence to absorb the wreckage. Marcus Webb had been her right hand for 8 years. He had stood at her swearing-in. He had sat through every briefing on the Marino asset seizures, briefings Betsy had conducted herself. "He used your trust as infrastructure," Pietro said factually. "That isn't a failure of your intelligence. It's a failure of his character. He used everything I gave him. I'd like to return the favor." She had come into this room a judge without a courtroom. She was leaving it something the law didn't have a title for yet, and looking at Pietro, she realized that might be exactly what she needed. It happened at 11 p.m. The documents were filed, the legal pads were full, and the case, built in an underground room by a dead judge and a living criminal, was as complete as it could be without the sealed federal records. Pietro had made food, pasta, bread, and olive oil. He set it down without announcement and sat across from her. They ate in the heavy silence of two people who had run out of words that weren't about the law. Finally, Betsy set her fork down. "Why did you follow me last night?" Pietro looked up, his expression unhurried. "You were leaving the courthouse at 9 p.m. during a trial that was not going in my favor. I had reason to believe someone was feeding info about my movements to an outside party. I was watching for interference." "You were watching me," she corrected. "Specifically. For how long?" He considered her with the measuring look of a man deciding how much truth to give. "A while," he said, before standing to clear the plates. He paused at the kitchen alcove. "There was a meeting. 7 months ago. It's the reason you're sitting in that chair instead of—" He stopped, not finishing the sentence. "Instead of what?" "Get some sleep," he said quietly. "The answer has been there for 7 months. It'll keep until morning." 7 months earlier, the Marino organization had a problem, a wire. A mid-level accountant named Reyes had been turned by a rival syndicate and had already passed documents to an ambitious federal prosecutor. The traditional solution was simple: eliminate the problem. But Pietro had looked at the docket and seen a name he recognized, Judge Betsy R. Johnson. He remembered her from a civil forfeiture case involving a dry cleaner named Edwin Park. Park had no lawyer and a flawed motion, but Johnson had, unprompted, appointed counsel and dismantled the task force's methodology in a 40-page ruling. "She's following a principle," Pietro had told his consigliere. He presented himself at her chambers at 7:41 p.m. on a Tuesday. He came alone and unarmed. When he was sent in, he found her standing behind her desk, formidable even without her robes. "Mr. Marino," she had said, "you have 5 minutes." Pietro told her the truth. The documents Reyes passed were obtained through coercion and would collapse under legal challenge. He wasn't offering a deal. He was handing her a flawed instrument before she tried to use it. He set a document on her desk demonstrating the coercion. "If this is accurate," she said slowly, "I will investigate, and then I will continue building the racketeering case against you through every legitimate means. I will convict you." "I know," Pietro said. "Then why tell me this?" "Because the coercion was wrong," he replied simply, "regardless of who it was aimed at." In the present, back in the bunker, Pietro finished the story over morning coffee. "You were going to lose," Betsy said, watching him. "And you still didn't interfere." "Because it was a fair case," he said. "And I don't interfere with fair things." Betsy looked at the evidence room door, then back at him. "My code has always been the law, correctly applied. That code didn't survive last Tuesday. I don't know what replaces it yet, but it starts with Marcus Webb not getting on a plane to Lisbon." Pietro's jaw set. He won't. She had spent 7 months building the case that would end him. He had spent 7 months making sure she stayed alive long enough to deliver it. The law, she was beginning to understand, had never prepared her for Pietro Marino at all. It started with a notification. Not on her phone. Her phone was a scorched piece of slag somewhere in a police evidence locker, but on Pietro's secondary monitor. It was a red-edged banner, the kind networks used to dress their most profitable tragedies. Breaking. Federal Judge Betsy R. Johnson confirmed dead in apparent assassination. Betsy saw it from across the room. She stood perfectly still, legal pad in hand, mid-sentence in a thought about shell company registration timelines. She read the banner twice. Then, with the slow, deliberate care of someone setting down something fragile, she placed the pad on the table and crossed to the monitor. The footage was cinematic. A traffic camera on the bridge overpass had caught the fireball, a clean, white-orange bloom that dissolved her car into light so completely that survival felt, even to her, like a physical impossibility. She watched herself die on 6 different channels. "Betsy." Pietro's voice was quiet behind her. She didn't turn around. "I'm fine," she said. The specific flatness of the words said everything about how untrue they were. Pietro didn't argue. He simply moved to stand beside her, not touching, just present, and watched the coverage in a silence that required no commentary. They watched for 20 minutes as the narrative wrote itself. The FBI had opened an investigation, and the working theory was already leaning toward organized crime. Retaliation for the Marino trial. Pietro's name was mentioned every 60 seconds. "They think you did it," Betsy said, her voice clinical. "Of course they do," Pietro replied. "It's the obvious conclusion. Defendant facing conviction, judge dies in a bombing. Elegant misdirection." "Don't compliment him," Betsy snapped. Her hands were at her sides, too still, the stillness of someone holding herself together by sheer force of will. On screen, the camera lingered on flowers being placed at the base of the courthouse steps. "I presided over a civil rights case 2 years ago," she said quietly, her eyes fixed on the bouquet. "A family named the Delaney's. When I ruled in their favor, the 8-year-old daughter stood up in the gallery and just clapped. She was so certain she was doing the right thing. I waited 4 seconds too long to call order." She watched a woman on the screen press a hand against the cold stone of the courthouse. "She doesn't know I can see her." It was the most unguarded thing she had said in 4 days. Pietro didn't try to resolve the grief. He let it exist. "She'll know," he said simply. "Eventually." At 3 p.m., the coverage shifted to a press conference. Marcus Webb approached the microphone. Betsy went stone still. He was impeccable in a black tie, his face a sculpture of institutional sorrow. He paused, that practiced, glycerin pause, before he began. "Judge Betsy R. Johnson was more than a colleague," Marcus said, his voice warm at the edges. "She was a standard. In 8 years, I never once saw her hesitate when the law required courage." Betsy watched him with a frozen, structural calm. It was a performance so obscene that her rage had moved beyond heat into something absolute and cold. Marcus promised the cameras that her legacy would not be buried. A single, perfectly timed tear tracked down his cheek. Betsy reached forward and killed the monitor. The silence in the bunker was deafening. "He cried," she said, her voice academic. "He actually cried." "Glycerin," Pietro said. "Or muscle response. Some people can do it on command." "He was studying me," she whispered. "Every habit, every vulnerability. For 8 years." She turned toward the concrete wall, then back to Pietro, the cold in her eyes now permanent. I want him to know. When it happens, I want him to look at me and understand that I watched that eulogy. That I heard every word. He'll know, Pietro promised. By midnight, the air in the bunker had shifted. The wine Pietro opened, a heavy Barolo, acted as a truth serum for two people too tired for pretense. They sat together, Betsy in the oversized shirt that smelled of him, nursing her glass. He'll get a lawyer, Betsy said, staring into the dark red liquid. He'll negotiate. He'll offer info on your syndicate in exchange for a reduced sentence. He'll walk away in 3 years. That's how the machine is designed. And you built your life inside that machine, Pietro observed. I built my life trying to run it correctly. Is that possible? Pietro asked, his voice low. Your system allowed a man like Marcus to build a bomb under your car while he held your coffee. My world is brutal, but it's consistent. Loyalty is rewarded, betrayal is punished. Your due process is just a promise filed in triplicate, while people like me do the real work in the neighborhoods you abandoned. Betsy opened her mouth to argue, but the counterargument, the statute, the precedent, felt like it was buried under the bridge. That's not a justification, she said carefully. I'm not asking for one, Pietro said. I'm asking you to stop pretending your way was clean. He looked at her, and for the first time he smiled, a full, illuminating expression that revealed the actual shape of the man. Betsy looked away, recognizing the danger of it. I have a case, she said finally, her voice steadying. And a defendant. And approximately no jurisdiction whatsoever. I'm going to have to figure out what justice looks like without a courtroom. That's where I've always operated, Pietro said, refilling her glass. By 1:30 a.m., they were in the small hours, the time when people say things they mean. Betsy told him about her apartment on the 14th floor, and her sister in Atlanta who was, at that moment, mourning a ghost. What about you? She asked. Is there someone? No, Pietro said. The risk calculus never resolved. Trust is too dangerous. He looked at her. Until now. You're the only person who looked at what I actually did instead of what they'd decided I was. I was still going to convict you, she reminded him. I know. That's why I trust you. Betsy stood, her ribs aching, and walked to the doorway of her room. She paused, looking back at the man who was both her captor and her only ally. You were right about one thing, Pietro. My world and yours are both incomplete. I don't know what a complete one looks like yet. Neither do I, he said. But it starts with Marcus Webb not getting on that plane. She nodded. Good night, Pietro. Good night, Betsy. She had walked into the bunker as a judge without a bench. She was walking through it now as something the law didn't have a category for. The gavel was silent, but she was not. And somewhere above them, Marcus Webb was sleeping the easy sleep of a man who believed his problem was buried. He had never been more wrong about anything in his life. It started as the best morning they'd had. Not good. Nothing about their situation qualified as good, but functional. It was the specific comfort of routine, finding a way to exist in impossible circumstances. Betsy was up at 6. The coffee was already made when Pietro emerged at 6:15. She had figured out the machine on day 2 and quietly assumed its operation. He took the cup she set on the counter without comment. She returned to her legal pads. It was the unspoken language of two people who had developed a shared grammar in close quarters. They spent the morning on the problem of the sealed federal records. Pietro had a contact, a forensic accountant named Silvana, who operated in the gray zone. She could bridge the gap, accessing the holding accounts through a back channel Pietro declined to explain, and Betsy declined to question. It was the most comfortable morning they'd had, which was, of course, exactly when everything fell apart. Pietro's secured phone buzzed at 11:43 a.m. He read the message, and his posture underwent a subtle, full-body recalibration. Betsy had learned to read this shift the way sailors read a darkening horizon. What? She asked, not looking up from her notes. Pietro was already moving toward the monitor bank. Unusual vehicle movement in a 2-block radius. 3 black SUVs. No plates. Rotating positions. Law enforcement? Wrong pattern, Pietro said, pulling up a street-level feed. Federal surveillance parks and stays. This is containment. He angled the screen toward her. A figure in civilian clothing paused at a specific point on the sidewalk directly above the bunker's primary ventilation access. They've been here before, Pietro said quietly. That's a confirmation pass. Someone told them where to look. Marcus, Betsy said. The word didn't need a follow-up. He knows my holding properties from the trial discovery, Pietro said, his jaw setting. But this isn't one of them. He's working from a secondary source. Someone current. He looked at her with a contained, cold fury. Get the pads. We have 20 minutes. Pietro moved with the unhurried speed of a man executing an emergency protocol. He packed the medical supplies and the annotated files into a single bag while Betsy secured her legal pads, pulling on his dark jacket, the one she had stopped apologizing for wearing. The tunnel runs northeast, Pietro directed. Comes up in the basement of a restaurant that owes me a significant favor. The tunnel was a concrete service corridor, low-ceilinged and smelling of old water. It was clearly maintained. The floor was clean, the utility bulbs functional. 12 years, Pietro answered her unspoken question. The city put this in. We made certain the contractor owed us something before it was finished. They were 80 meters from the exit when the door had opened. It wasn't his people. 2 men in dark clothing stepped into the light, moving with the coordinated efficiency of professionals. Pietro's arm went across Betsy's chest, shoving her into the shadow of a utility alcove. The men were moving toward them, meaning the restaurant's favor had been renegotiated without Pietro's input. Maintenance hatch, Pietro breathed. 40 meters back. Go. The lead man's flashlight swept the tunnel and caught them. Everything happened at speed. Pietro moved toward the threat the instant the light hit, closing the distance to remove the variable of space. He took the first man down with a brutal economy of motion, but the second had already pulled a weapon. The gunshot was acoustically catastrophic, a physical pressure wave that bounced off the concrete walls. Pietro went down, not a fall of unconsciousness, but a sharp, controlled drop. He caught himself against the wall, his left hand clutching his right side. Dark red began to spread through his shirt. Betsy didn't think. The second man was recalibrating, finding her in his sights. Pietro's jacket had an interior pocket she had felt for days. Her hand moved. The weapon was heavier and colder than 15 years of evidentiary familiarity had ever conveyed. The man saw her reach. She didn't give him the 2 seconds he needed. She shot wide on purpose. She was a judge, not an executioner. The concrete chipped beside the man's head, causing him to flinch instinctively. In that fraction of a second, she crossed the gap. Using the leverage principle from a self-defense seminar she'd taken years ago, she disarmed him and sent him to the floor. The tunnel went silent. Betsy stood over the men, breathing hard, weapon in one hand and legal pads under her arm. Pietro. She was across the tunnel in 4 steps. He was upright, his eyes clear. Show me, she commanded. It's a graze, he said, his voice too steady. She moved his hand. The bullet had channeled across his ribs, bleeding significantly but not vital. We need to move, he said. Can you walk? I was walking before you were born. Yes or no, Pietro? Yes. They reached a motel 3 blocks from the exit. Room 14. It was the kind of place that asked no questions. Pietro sat on the closed toilet lid in the cramped bathroom, his shirt off. It was a practical matter, but the space was very small. Betsy cleaned the wound with antiseptic. He didn't flinch. This is the 4th time I've been shot, he said, reading her mind. The first was a misunderstanding. This one was Marcus Webb's fault. Don't take credit for his work. She looked up at him. In the low light, the operational composure was still there, but beneath it, something had loosened. She threaded the needle from the medical kit. I've done this once. On a rotation in law school. Wilderness first aid. Has it been useful? Until tonight, no. Hold still. She worked with clinical focus, leaning close. Pietro looked at the wall with a deliberate attention. You could have run, he said quietly. The hatch was behind you. You were shot, she said, as if it were the only statute that mattered. That's not a strategic answer. No, she agreed, tying off the second stitch. It isn't. When she finished the third, he turned his head and looked at her directly. It's who you are, Betsy. And it's why, of the 2 of us, you're the one who should be deciding what comes next. I'll provide the infrastructure. You provide the judgment. The offer was enormous. This was Pietro Marino subordinating his world to her standard. She looked at the sutures, 3 clean stitches. Not bad, he assessed. Don't flatter me. I'm telling you the truth. They were closer than the room required. You need to rest, she said, her discipline acting as a shield. Betsy, thank you. For not running. She looked at him, then at the single bar of motel soap, overwhelmed by the magnitude of the moment. Don't get shot again, she said, and left the bathroom before she could lose her grip on the distance between them. The motel room had one bed. They addressed it with the efficiency of the exhausted. Pietro took the side by the door. Betsy lay on top of the covers, staring at the water-stained ceiling. "Pietro," she whispered into the dark. "The second leak. Someone current." "How many people knew about that location?" "4," he said, "including Aldo." "Marcus knew about Aldo," she says slowly. From the trial documents, the financial records listed Aldo as a senior operational advisor, Pietro says. "Yes. He'd have approached him," she says. "Found his pressure point." "Aldo is how old?" 71, Pietro says. "Family?" "A daughter. 2 grandchildren. In Naples." Betsy closes her eyes. "There's your leverage," she says quietly. The ceiling absorbs this. Outside, a car passes. Its headlights sweep the curtain and are gone. A long silence followed. "Aldo, the consigliere. 40 years of loyalty." "Tomorrow," she said, watching the amber light of the parking lot crawl under the curtain, "we figure out how to come back from the dead." "I've never done that before," she added. "No," Pietro said. "But I have." She turned her head. In the thin light, she saw his profile, jaw set, eyes open. The silence between them, as they lay on opposite sides of the same mattress, was the loudest thing in the room. She had walked into the bunker a judge. She had walked out of the tunnel something harder. She had walked into this motel room something she didn't have a name for yet, but it lived in the 3 stitches she'd put in his side, and the way he'd said thank you like it cost him something, and the way she'd left the bathroom before the moment could become the thing she already knew it was becoming. They didn't talk about the night. This was the unspoken treaty of the morning. The motel room existed in a sealed compartment that neither was ready to open. Betsy was up before sunrise. Pietro was already awake when she rose. Serious people handle the things they cannot name by finding the next problem and pressing themselves against it until the previous one stops demanding attention. Pietro's stitches held. He checked them in the mirror with the brief, assessing focus of a man performing maintenance, not drama. Betsy watched from the doorway for exactly 1 second, then went to find coffee. The vending machine produced something that was technically coffee, and she brought 2 cups back, setting one on the nightstand without ceremony. The grammar of their shared life had become very efficient. "My network located a thread," Pietro said, his voice a low gravel. "A man named Carver. He's a logistics man, mercenary space. He was present at the bomb site 48 hours before the detonation." "Is he a source?" Betsy asked. "He's a handler. He knows the chain of custody for the device. He knows who hired him." Pietro looked at her. "I know how to get him to a location. I know how to get him to tell the truth once we're there," Betsy countered. For the first time, they didn't look at each other with the layered professional assessment of the last 5 days. They looked at each other as partners. "We'll need somewhere that isn't a motel," Betsy said. "I have a space," Pietro replied. "Aldo doesn't know about it." The space was above a dry cleaner in the warehouse district, 2 windowless rooms that had absorbed many difficult conversations. Carver sat in a chair in the center of the inner room, a nondescript man in his mid-40s with the contained stillness of a survivor. Pietro stood in the corner, shadowed behind Carver's eyeline. This was Betsy's room. She sat across from Carver, refusing the distance of a desk. She didn't raise her voice. She didn't perform. She simply read him, the tells, the hollow spots in his posture, the way he breathed. She asked questions in the precise order designed to make lying structurally expensive. "You didn't know who the judge was when you were hired," she said. "I don't ask names," Carver muttered. "But you found out." A pause. "Just long enough. After. And you stayed on the job. Why?" Her voice was quiet, fueled by a curiosity more unsettling than an accusation. Carver looked at her for a long moment. "Because the man who hired me," he said slowly, "made it very clear that walking away was a more permanent decision than staying. Marcus." The shape of him was finally visible, a man who used institutional authority as a weapon the same way Pietro used a syndicate. Within 22 minutes, Betsy had what she needed: 3 names, 2 locations, and a financial transfer reference number. A chain of custody admissible in any federal court. She stood and smoothed her jacket. "For what it's worth, you just made the right choice." In the outer room, Pietro fell into step beside her. 22 minutes, he noted. "Most of my people take considerably longer." "Your people," Betsy said, "use the wrong tools." They debriefed in an unremarkable car a few blocks away. Pietro spread the reality in front of her. They had enough to destroy Marcus. And Pietro had a plane. You could be gone by tonight, Pietro said, his voice flat and sincere. Portugal. Or Italy. A real legal restructuring, a new life. You'd lose the one you had, but you'd have a life. Betsy listened to the whole offer. The generosity of it stung more than a threat would have. No, she said. Pietro looked at her, his hands still on the wheel. He gave a eulogy, Betsy said, her voice beginning to vibrate with a suppressed, tectonic fury. He stood at the podium where I've stood 100 times and used my name to build his protection. He cried actual tears. I am not getting on a plane. She breathed, the precision of her judicial mask slipping just enough to show the fire beneath. I came back from the dead. I'm not going to spend it hiding in Portugal. The gala, Pietro said. She turned her head. The Hargrove Foundation gala this Saturday, he continued. Marcus will be there. It's his public rehabilitation event. Half the federal judiciary will be in that room. The U.S. attorney, the circuit judges. It's the one place where his entire network of protection will be present to witness his exposure, Betsy realized. Yes. You need a ghost, she said. I need the judge, he corrected. Betsy looked at him, her decision finalized. I need a dress. I know someone, Pietro said, and the precursor to a smile moved across his face. It happened at midnight in the new safe house, a townhouse 3 layers removed from Pietro's name. Betsy was reviewing the gala's floor plan, the light of a single lamp casting long shadows over her legal pads. Pietro had just ended a call in the next room. He came to the doorway and watched her. Stop clicking the pen, he said. She looked down, realizing she had been doing it for 40 minutes. She set it down. The security detail rotates every 45 minutes. If we enter through the east side at 11:15. Betsy. He had crossed the room. He was closer than the doorway now, standing in the specific gravity that had been building between them since the bridge. Neither of them moved for exactly 3 seconds. Then she did. Betsy Johnson had always known when the evidence was complete. She moved first. The kiss was not tentative. It was the kiss of 2 people who were done performing uncertainty. It was firm, clear, and final. Pietro's hand came up, his uninjured side, and cupped her jaw with the same precise care he had used on a wound in a bunker. The gentleness of it was the most destabilizing thing she had felt all week. She pulled back first, her breath hitching. The floor plan was still there. The gala was still Saturday. Marcus was still sleeping the sleep of the innocent. The east entrance, Betsy said, her voice remarkably steady despite the roar in her ears. 11:15 rotation. Betsy, Pietro said. What? The ghost smile was fuller now, illuminating the room. I know. She almost smiled back. This time, she didn't stop it. Saturday. Saturday, he agreed. She had walked into the interrogation room a woman, without a courtroom. She had walked out of it as a judge who had learned that truth doesn't always wait for a subpoena. She had walked into the safe house telling herself the plan was the only thing that mattered. She had walked out of it knowing that was almost true. The gala was Saturday. Marcus was sleeping, and Betsy R. Johnson, dead to the world, alive to herself, and kissed at midnight in a townhouse that didn't officially exist, was ready to deliver the verdict she hadn't been allowed to finish. Saturday arrived with the specific, irreversible weight of a verdict already reached. The question was never if, only when. The dress Pietro's contact provided was not a disguise, it was a declaration. Midnight blue, structured at the shoulder, clean at the line, it didn't hide the woman wearing it. It announced her. Betsy stood before the mirror for 60 seconds. The woman looking back had a healing amber bruise at her temple and the posture of someone built for federal courtrooms, a spine that no explosion or motel room had managed to bend. She put on the black pearl earrings Pietro had left on the counter and walked out. Pietro was waiting in black tie, his suit a precise instrument of black wool and dark intention. He looked up, and for 2 seconds his composure slipped. She filed that look away somewhere warm. The bruise, he noted. Good, she replied. Let them wonder how I got it. She picked up her clutch, containing a USB drive, a signed warrant, and the most precisely written statement of her life, and met his gaze. I've been ready since Tuesday. They arrived at the Meridian Club at 11:08 p.m., entering through separate doors on separate rotations. Betsy walked into the gala alone. She had always walked into courtrooms alone. The room was a symphony of chandeliers, string quartets, and the quiet hum of institutional power. Marcus was in the northeast corner, laughing with Circuit Judge Clarence Whitmore. He was wearing her name like a stolen coat, repurposing her death as his career launchpad. The cold thing in Betsy's chest settled into something structural. She moved. The disturbance started at the edges, a wave of stillness moving through the room as 600 people processed the impossible. Silence spread until even the quartet faltered. Betsy walked through the center of the room, spine straight, the amber bruise gold in the light. Marcus saw her at 30 feet. She watched the sequential collapse of his composure, the laugh dying, the hand dropping, the blood systematically leaving his face. "Betsy," he whispered as she reached him. "Good evening, Marcus," she said, her voice filling the silence with the projection of 15 years on the bench. She didn't raise her voice. She spoke with the calm of a judge delivering a final order. "I've been reviewing the evidence in my absence," she said, her words carrying to the widening circle of guests. "I've found that the Hargrove Foundation received $800,000 from Marino syndicate accounts, liquidated by the person managing the trial evidence. The same person who contracted a man named Carver to place an IED beneath my car." The room was architecturally silent. "That person," she continued, "delivered a eulogy containing 17 direct quotes from my 2019 Bar Association speech." He kept notes. She set the federal arrest warrant on the table. "This was signed this morning by Magistrate Torres. It belongs to your office, James," she added, handing the document to U.S. Attorney James Poole, who had moved into the inner circle. Poole took the warrant with institutional muscle memory. He nodded once and looked at Marcus. The room began to breathe again, the sound of 100 stories being born. While Betsy held the room's eyes, Pietro operated in the blind spot. He extracted Marcus's encrypted messages and contact lists to the USB drive within 90 seconds. He had a quiet conversation with Marcus's associate, Drouet, who vanished through the service exit immediately. By the time the feds escorted Marcus out, Pietro was back at the bar, casually unremarkable. Marcus passed within 10 feet of Betsy on his way out. He stopped, looking at her with the involuntary shock of a man in freefall. She said nothing. The verdict was the statement, everything else was administration. Pietro was suddenly beside her as the crowd began to murmur. "USB?" she asked. "Done. Drouet handled. Aldo is being addressed tonight." Judge Whitmore reached them first, his expression unreadable. "Betsy, you have a great deal of explaining to do." "I'll be in my office Monday, Clarence," she said, a real smile finally touching her lips. They left at 1:04 a.m. side by side. The city air was cool and indifferent to the historical event that had just occurred. "The racketeering case doesn't disappear," Betsy said as they stood on the pavement. "He was guilty of what he was charged with. That doesn't change because he saved my life." "No," Pietro agreed. "So what happens now?" Betsy looked at the city, then at the man beside her. "I resign Monday, and then I'm going to need an office. Fear is a terrible foundation for an empire, Pietro. It's unstable. Loyalty, properly structured with consistency and a standard that doesn't change, that's sustainable." Pietro's expression exceeded his already revised expectations. "You want to restructure it? I want to run it. With my judgment and your infrastructure. I think we can do better than approximating justice." A long silence followed, the silence of a man encountering his destination. "The matriarch of law," he murmured, naming the new shape of things. "Don't call me that," she said, and almost laughed. The sound was brief, unguarded, and real. Pietro held out his hand. Not a kiss, not a dramatic embrace, but an open hand, the only language of partnership he trusted. Betsy looked at him, and took it. She had walked into the room a ghost. She walked out as something without precedent. The gavel was gone, but the judgment was irrevocably hers. And she had just decided what to do with it. She woke before dawn. It was an old habit. The federal judiciary runs on a schedule that disciplines the body into early rising, much like military service. For 15 years, 5:47 a.m. had been her time. The body remembered even when the robe was gone. She lay still in the suite Pietro had arranged. It was clean, quiet, and invisible. Through the window, the city was a pre-dawn gray, the specific, pre-articulate light of a morning that hadn't decided what it would be yet. She thought about her apartment, her river window, and the 10 minutes of coffee that used to belong entirely to her. She wondered what belonging entirely to herself was going to mean now that she was surrendering her institutional identity. She stood at the window for exactly 10 minutes with her coffee. Then she got dressed. Chief Judge Clarence Whitmore's office smelled of old wood and the concentrated gravity of significant decisions. The American flag stood in the corner near framed judicial commissions, and a collection of obscure first-edition legal texts Betsy had borrowed from for a decade. She sat across from him at 9 a.m. He had closed the door, an acknowledgement that this conversation was different. "You look terrible," Whitmore said, "and better than I've seen you look in years. I'm not sure how to account for that." "Clarity," she said. "It has a certain cosmetic effect." "The arrest warrant." "The evidence package," Whitmore noted. "Poole's office is calling it the most airtight submission they've received in 11 years. He wants to know how you compiled it while officially dead. With significant assistance from sources I am not prepared to formally identify." Whitmore's eyes held hers. He was 70 years old and had been reading people for 4 decades. "Pietro Marino," he said. "It wasn't an accusation, it was a name." "The charges against him," Betsy said carefully, "were built on evidence that Marcus Webb had the opportunity to manipulate. The integrity of that case will need independent review." A very judicial answer. "I am still a federal judge." For approximately 40 more minutes. She set an envelope on the desk. Whitmore didn't open it immediately. "The system failed you," he said. "The system was used against me by someone who understood it better than he should have." "That's different." "The system didn't fail. A person did." She met his eyes. "I'm leaving the bench, Clarence. I'm not leaving the law. The law goes with me. It was always mine. The appointment was just infrastructure." Whitmore read the resignation. He nodded once, the nod of a man trusting something he didn't fully understand, because the person in front of him had earned it. "I'll expect a full account," he said. "Eventually." "You'll have it." She stood, straightening her jacket. "Thank you. For 40 minutes of still being your judge." "You were always more than that," Whitmore replied, his mouth resolving into a rare smile. "Whatever you're doing next, try not to end up in my courtroom on the other side of things." "I'll do my best." "That," he said, "is what worries me." She made the call from a park bench across from the courthouse. She dialed her sister, Diane, and when the voice from Atlanta answered, the last 8 days of held breath finally exhaled. "Hi," Betsy said. There was a sound on the other end that was not a word. "I'm okay," Betsy said. "I'm sitting in a park. I just resigned my judgeship." Then they both started crying. It was the most undignified and most human thing that had happened since Tuesday. They talked for 40 minutes, not about the bunker or the bomb, but about being alive and the fact that celery and potato salad was still a mistake. By the end of the call, something had settled in her that the gala and the verdict could not reach. She looked at the courthouse steps where flowers had been laid for her, then she stood and walked in the other direction. At 2 p.m., she walked into a boardroom in the financial district. 7 of Pietro's senior people sat at the table. Pietro was at the head. Betsy sat at the opposite end, the geometry of 2 people who lead together. She had changed into a dark, structured suit that lacked the visual language of the judiciary. She was not a judge here. She was something that didn't have an established wardrobe yet. "Good afternoon," she said, her voice filling the room with easy authority. "I'm going to speak briefly, and then I'm going to listen. My name is Betsy Johnson. I've reviewed the operational structure of this organization, and I have some observations about its vulnerabilities." Ferrante, an underboss with 22 years in the family, tested the air. "With respect, I'm not clear on what the new arrangement brings to a discussion of enforcement protocol." Betsy looked at him with the cold precision she reserved for procedural errors. "The new arrangement brings a complete review of your territory's financial discrepancies for the last 14 months, which show a pattern of skimming that is either embezzlement or the most expensive series of accounting errors in history. I'm prepared to accept its errors, if you'd like to walk me through the methodology." The room went silent. Ferrante looked at Pietro. Pietro was looking at Betsy with the quiet delight of a man watching exactly what he expected. He didn't intervene. He let her run it. "I'd be glad," Ferrante said carefully, "to walk you through the accounting." After the meeting, she and Pietro were alone. "Aldo met with my people," Pietro said, staring out the window. "Marcus threatened his family in Naples. Aldo was managing the threat alone for 6 months. He was protecting you," Betsy said, "in the way he knew how. By feeding our location to people who wanted us dead?" Pietro turned. "In my world, the accounting for this is—" "Pietro." She stopped him. "What do you believe is right? You told me the verdict should be mine. But Aldo is yours. What is the standard?" Pietro paused. It was likely the first time anyone had asked him what he believed was right rather than what precedent demanded. "He should go to Naples," he said finally. "To his grandchildren. And stay there." Then that's the verdict, Betsy said. The precedent is that this organization distinguishes between betrayal from greed and betrayal from fear. That is the standard that makes an organization sustainable. Later that evening, he showed her an office 2 floors above the boardroom. It was a corner room with the city on both sides. On the desk sat a new legal pad and a pen. When? She asked, standing in the doorway. 7 months ago, Pietro said. Around the time the trial began. She turned to look at him. 7 months ago, the moment he sat across from a judge who actually saw him, and the calculus of his life shifted. He met her eyes and didn't elaborate. He didn't have to. I'm going to need the Ferrante files by Wednesday, she said, crossing to the desk. And the full territorial map. I want to understand the structure before I change it. I'll have them, Pietro said. It's yours, Betsy. It was always going to be yours. He left her to it. She sat down, picking up the pen and turning it once in her hand, the physical vocabulary of a mind that thinks an argument. She opened the pad to the first page and began. She had resigned at 9, cried at 10, and taken the room apart by 2. Now, at 6, she sat at her new desk in the life she had chosen with full information. The gavel was silent. The robe was folded. And Betsy R. Johnson wrote the first line of a different kind of law. 6 months had a way of turning a revolution into a landscape. The skyline of the city, viewed from the balcony of the new headquarters, no longer looked like a map of battlegrounds. It looked like a project. The air was colder now, the sharp, clean chill of late autumn, but the glass beneath Betsy's hand was steady. She leaned against the railing, watching the rhythmic pulse of the streets below. The streets were quieter, though not from silence. It was the quiet of a machine that had been oiled, recalibrated, and put under new management. The chaotic, jagged violence of the previous year had been replaced by a structured peace, a world where the consequences were predictable and the standard was absolute. Pietro stepped out from the warmth of the office, his presence announced by the soft click of the door and the scent of the espresso he carried. He didn't speak. He simply came to stand beside her, his shoulder an inch from hers, looking out at the grid of lights they had spent half a year rewiring. The Ferrante audit is complete, she said, her voice level. He's been moved to logistics. The new oversight committee is in place in the 3rd district. And the police commissioner? Pietro asked. He's learning that a donation to the foundation is a better career move than a payout from a shell company, Betsy replied. She turned her head slightly. He tried to cite precedent. I told him I'm the one who writes the precedents now. Pietro's mouth moved, not quite a smile, but the deep, satisfied light that had become his most frequent expression when they were alone. I imagine he found that argument difficult to counter. He found it final, she said. The city hummed beneath them, a living testament to a partnership that shouldn't have worked, and yet had become the only thing that did. The old systems, the courtrooms that could be bought, the syndicates that ruled by fear, the ghosts of men like Marcus Webb, had been dismantled and repurposed. In their place stood something harder and more honest. Betsy looked at Pietro's hand on the railing, the one that had caught her on a bridge when the world was ending. She reached out and covered his hand with hers. No appeals, he asked quietly. Betsy looked out at the horizon, where the lights of the city met the dark of the sky. She thought of the robe she had left behind and the life she had found in the shadows. There were no more benches, no more gavels, and no more rooms where she had to wait for permission to be right. No appeals, she agreed. The verdict is final. They stood together in the cold air, 2 architects of a new world, watching the city they had saved from its own corruption. The law was no longer an institutional appointment or a set of books in a dusty library. It was the way they breathed, the way they ruled, and the specific, unbreakable front they held against the dark. The new law was their own. And as the first snow of the season began to fall, Betsy R. Johnson knew that, for the first time in her life, justice wasn't just a pursuit. It was home. If you enjoyed this story of love, betrayal, and impossible choices, don't forget to hit that like button, share this video with your friends, and subscribe to our channel for more heart-stopping love stories just like this. And hey, turn on the notification bell so you never miss the next twist of passion and suspense.